we'll start. No?
Okay.
It's a great pleasure and be able to tell us more.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored you would let me take some of your time today. Thank you very much for letting me come. This is my first time in Spain. I think it's beautiful. I love it. I'm okay with the cold weather. I come from Florida, where it's always too hot. Even now, if I go back, it'll be too hot. So this is actually okay. But I'm standing here, and I know you're not. So if you want to come closer, this is the good place to be. Okay, so I'm from the University of Central Florida. How many of you have been to Florida? A few of you? Okay. How many of you know something about Florida? Okay, what do you know about Florida? Somebody in the back.
Manatees.
Manatees, yeah? What else? Disneyland. Everglades. Okay, okay. Florida is a rather strange place, right? It thinks it's the place where citrus comes from, but you know otherwise, right? If you Google, why is Florida so, you get all those things. If I ask, why is Sevilla so, I only get that.
Expensive.
Hot and expensive. But Florida, we can claim strange, Republican, expensive, so we have that too. Hot this year, hot and humid. Do you have hot and humid? We have hot and humid. Yeah. Florida is also weird. Florida is weird. There's a famous bunch of information out there about Florida Man. Florida Man. This man tried to use a Sharpie marker as a disguise when he robbed a store. Okay? Florida Man. Welcome to Florida, the worst state. Go home, Florida, you're drunk. Florida woman on tricycle says she is God, robs postal worker with toy gun. This is normal news in Florida, okay? So if you're to come to Florida, be prepared for weird, okay? Florida, okay? It's such a strange place that there are comedy writers who make a living writing about the weird stories. And what's fun is that this man, Carl Hiaasen, is a journalist. All of his stories come from the news. He just saves the clippings of the news story and he weaves them into a novel, okay? Honest, that's what he does, okay? Dave Barry is a comedy writer. Best state ever for a comedy writer, okay? So that's Florida. And then there's other parts of Florida I want to share with you as well. What I hope to do today is to compare and contrast the seasonal wetlands in what I'm calling broadly the North Everglades. North, not necessarily the Everglades you might think of. And I'll show you maps. And then I want to see if that compares with what you do here. And I'm wondering if it matches in some ways for both basic and applied ecology. So what I want to do is set out a context, see if it makes sense to you, and I want to try to summarize the ecologies, which I'm going to try to summarize the Florida ecology more because I'm not the one to summarize your work, right? So you know your work. I'll try to summarize Florida a bit more, but hopefully you see the match, okay? And then maybe there's some interesting ways forward. So why do I want to compare and contrast? Have you heard of Bloom's taxonomy? It's an educational ladder or pyramid. It's useful. If you're doing higher level work, creating, evaluating, analyzing, you're doing things that include compare and contrast. So it's a higher level synthesis. It's a useful tool for thinking about things at a higher level, right? As opposed to, for example, when we're just trying to memorize and then maybe think about straightforward pathways. So it's a good way to try to think about things at higher levels. So if I think about Florida, it's obviously different geographically, but it's similar in some parts. So a lot of Florida is flat, but there's a sand ridge comes down here, actually multiple ridges of sand. Very, I think, maybe like what you find in Doñana. And then there's, of course, a very different geological context here. And notice, too, that we're a bit south, and so it's somewhat subtropical. But I have to say, when I was in Malaga for the conference, many of the plants are the same, right? They're the same plants, right? I don't see a big difference there. I haven't been here long enough, so we'll find out. Okay, this is all of the Everglades, where Orlando, where I live, is up here, and it flows down through the Kissimmee River and hits Lake Okeechobee. Naturally, there would have been another river, and then this great seeping river of grass, this giant, flat, wet meadow south of the lake, okay? What it has now is very different, where there are many canals that now drain the lake laterally in different places to try to control flooding. Why? Because people wanted to build. We want to have condos with tourists. We want to have lands to develop, right? So it's drained so that there's more land to build on and do things with. So there's this giant seep comes down this way, and in that way, it is somewhat similar in that it's a fairly large river basin moving south. The difference is that this is South Everglades, and this North Everglades is, I think, a little more similar to you with the river very nearby. You tell me, we'll see, okay? So I'm going to talk about the North Everglades up here, okay? This is a very different system and would be much more like your marshes, okay, than the temporary wetlands. So if I zoom in some more, this is North Everglades again, the lake, big Lake Okeechobee, many canals down here. I'm going to be working in this area right here, okay? I'll show you some pictures there. And if I'm talking too fast, throw something at me, okay? I do that when I get excited. So this is a Google Earth, air image kind of thing, looking up Florida. So I'm going to get the right button. Here's that lake again. All of this is Everglades, the way you normally think of Everglades. But up here is a bit different. It's a different kind of landscape, a little maybe more like Doñana. So you can see if I zoom in, there's a lot of very managed lands south of the lake, Lake Okeechobee, south of the lake. That's all sugarcane fields. And then they started getting into these big managed areas and becomes more natural vegetation. North of the lake, there are two places I want to focus on. One is Archbold Biological Station, and one is a ranch that's also managed by Archbold Biological Station. At least one person here knows about Archbold. Has anybody else heard of Archbold? Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, well, Pedro would have contaminated your. Yeah, no, Pedro. Oh, good. Okay. Okay. So, the ranch is right there, and I'll show you many more pictures. What I think you can see well with this is the pile of sand, the sand ridge. So the history of Florida is that it was inundated for much time, and there was water all the way up to here. So this is an old beach dune, and so these soils here are 100,000 years old, okay, variable, and interglacials. And so a lot of this was underwater at various times, so there's old coral down underneath, but then sand on top, too. So this is very flat, and this you come up, oh, it's so high. It must be, 50 meters. It's so high, and up onto the sand pile, right, it runs along here. Many lakes where it's collapsed down through, but two different kinds of places that I think maybe have some comparisons for Doñana. You'll tell me. So there's the biological station where a lot of our students work, and my colleague, Pedro Quintana Asensio, and then the MacArthur Agroecology Research Center. I'll just call the ranch, because it is a cattle ranch. And we've been working there as well, Pedro and I, as well as other colleagues. So what I want to do is think about real briefly, do these comparisons make any sense? Does it fit at all? So there's maybe some easy ways to do that. So biogeographically, they're both peninsulas. Different, but they're both peninsulas. Okay. There's many, many wetlands in, I'm going to call an archipelago. This is just the count that are at the two places, Archbold and at the ranch. You have many more in Doñana. But we have thousands of wetlands, often small and nearby, right? Not too far. So I think we have some comparisons that way. There's an aerial photograph again, where here is that sand pile, and you can see lots of agriculture. There's citrus that grows there. This natural land here is Archbold, and over here, just go down the road, this is the ranch. So they're very close to each other. It's easy to go back and forth, okay? So the broad scale at a big distance geomorphology, I think maybe is somewhat comparable, where we have an ancient marine reef plateau in Florida with marine sands that have piled up over the top of that in the Pleistocene. You have a different kind of geology ultimately, but the Aeolian soils especially, I think, are somewhat like the marine sands, very ancient and well-leached marine sands. So I think the sandy soils on the ridge and on top of the limestone may be somewhat comparable. We'll see. The soils are really well-leached, enough rainfall that there's virtually no nutrient in them. And you guys have very stabilized sands, I think, are comparable to the ones that I'm thinking of in Florida. The topography anywhere in Florida, 1 meter is a huge difference, whether you're going to be wet or dry. And same in the stable sands in here, I think. Okay. Not that you can see all this, but I wanted to just try to illustrate. There is an imaginary transect down the peninsula, and that's this line here. So the soils in that area I'm talking about are Pleistocene, Holocene, or Pleistocene, Pliocene sediments, shelly sediments, shelly sands. So I think comparable to the stabilized sands. Yeah? Okay. It's beautiful. Okay. That's my only rainbow picture. Well, this is the ranch, and yes, for cattle, it's big pastures. And this is one of my pretty pictures of a wetland up at the station. So there's many, many of those kinds of wetlands. Many of them are smaller, not all as pretty. The wetlands at the ranch are going to be in the meadow, in the pasture, and you might not even see them until you've walked right into one. They're a bit different.
Temporary ponds, right?
Yes. Yes, temporary ponds, thousands of them. There are canals that the ranchers use to manage water and irrigate in different ways that might be sort of comparable to some of the agricultural lands around Doñana National Park, but you can tell me. So I think we have some, now closer in, I think it's somewhat similar. We have the sandy soils, so the groundwater, the precipitation filling up the soils, filling the pools, I think is a very comparable system. We have karst depressions, so it is deflation basins. The limestone erodes and collapses, so they're little depressional wetlands, okay? So the limestone down deep, not connected in the groundwater, but the surface collapses. That's a little different than what you have, which are interdunal and deflation basins. But they end up being small, similar shapes in general. Would you say most of the temporary ponds at Doñana are oval, round, or stretched? Both? Yeah. So maybe more variety than I think what we have. Most of ours are going to be round because they collapse, but still disconnected from the groundwater in the limestone. Only soil water, okay? We both, I think, have a fair amount of human-modified drainage. There's those irrigation canals that they will use to try to water. There's a lot of canals that they use to drain the fields in the ranch. Up at Archbold Biological Station, there's no drainage. So again, it's a mixture there. Okay, I stole these from a climate website, so I'll have to help see this. We're subtropical and versus Mediterranean, but again, kind of similar. There's a summer-autumn flooding cycle. So the blue is rain, and so this is 6, 7, 8, 9. You can see much rain in the summer months, right? Whereas 6, 7, 8, 9, dry months, right? Okay. That's the same number here as here. The scales are different, okay? So for temperature, we're approaching 30 C. For temperature, you're approaching 30 C. So comparable temperatures, but the precipitation, I'm going to see, I think that's 100 right there, and this is 100 here. So we have more precipitation, you don't quite get to 100. Yeah? So we have a lot of rain in the hot summer months, but flooding, the ponds flood after that, you would have a different seasonal timing, of course, right? And I think that might be an interesting contrast, and I'll get to in a second. Okay. So how about the geochemistry? We have generally low pH, well-leached sands, the tannic, humic, fulvic acids moving through the soils, coming out. Looks like weak coffee. Nothing like your coffee here. Looks like American coffee. Or tea, yeah? This is typical across most of our peninsula. Whereas you guys are more circumneutral, I think, yeah? What we have is, again, in the center of the peninsula, no marine influence. There's no salt water, whereas, of course, you have a gradient of marine influence with nearby to the ocean. It makes more sense. Ours, we have a range, at least at the ranch, where we call semi-natural. They're oligotrophic. They've never been fertilized. Less ditching to control flooding, etc. And I think that matches what I'm assuming many of your temporary wetlands are also oligotrophic. Is that fair to say? I think. But some maybe are more fertilized than others, yeah? Okay. And that's where we get into this mixture, too, where ranchers have for years applied fertilizer onto the soils, and so it will be there for a long time, phosphate, and they still put nitrogen down. So I think we have also an interesting mixture there. Okay. So let's see if we can keep score. Matches and mismatches. And you tell me if I have it wrong, okay? Peninsula, yeah. Sandy soils, yeah. Groundwater driven, yeah. Annual mean temperatures are comparable, and I think naturally oligotrophic. But we have very different seasonal timing of flooding, and you guys would have some marine influence in some wetlands where Florida, we won't, okay? So far, yeah? 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 All right, so let's see, biodiversity. Yeah, some parts sort of a match, some parts no. We have, whoops, wrong one. We have, I counted 28 mammal species, 26 non-bats. Okay, close. You have many more birds than we do, especially the water birds, way more water birds. And that sort of makes some sense to me too, being you at the southern end of the flyway before going over, right? And I think that'll be another interesting contrast. Comparable amphibians, maybe comparable fish. We're trying to get more fish all the time with invasives. We just keep shoving them in all the time. So maybe we'll get more. Yeah. Many aquatic insects, of course. I have no idea how many microcrustaceans we have. It's one of my great shames. I don't know. I should know this. It's what I started off doing, and I don't know. We have about 180 wetland plant. You have many more wetland plant species. I think that's interesting too. Okay, so but there's some parts that are comparable, some parts that are not. So I'm going to say overall, some of diversity matches up pretty well, but I think you have much more bird and plant diversity. Yeah? Okay. This button. Oh, that was, by the way, a limpkin. They're a very fun bird. They have a strange call, and they wander around, and they like eating snails. And so they're doing well at the ranch now because of the big invasive snail that's moving in, and they're breeding now at the ranch where they didn't before. So they're actually eating the invasive well. So anyway. Okay, I think one of the biggest differences is that we have been far more experimental. This is a private biological station and a private ranch that manages cattle, 3,000 head of cattle, something like that, and doing research at the same time, sometimes about cattle, but also about the lands in the wetlands. Whereas you can't necessarily be experimental in Doñana National Park, yes? So I think we have very different research histories, and I think that might be an interesting contrast. We have been angling quite a bit more applied, publishing in more applied journals than in basic. Whereas I think it's fair to say you guys have been doing much more of the really cool natural history and basic ecology, and some applied, of course, too, right? So I think we have a difference there, okay? We have been doing, for example, this big experiment where we fenced off wetlands and kept cattle out. And so there's a big difference, though, between what I'm talking about, my own personal experience, mostly at the ranch, versus what other people do at the station, like where Pedro Quintana Asensio has been working for a long time up here, my colleague in my department. So I've been biasing it towards the ranch. There are people at the station who do other kinds of basic ecology. So, let me get this right. Reed Bowman studies the scrub jays. Eric Menges plays around with the plants in the high scrub. So these guys, they miss the best part. They go around the wetlands to get to this hot, dry, white sand and study the plants there. And they ignore the wetlands. The best part. They don't really, Archbold doesn't know much about their wetlands. It's very interesting. Mark Darup, who just recently retired, is their insect collection curator. He's very much about describing new species and maintaining collection, and very much about the natural history. And Betsy Rothermel is their restoration ecologist and herpetologist, and she's been largely focusing on gopher tortoises, but also restoration of these big meadows of grasses underneath the pines. But she started off doing wetlands work, so we could also go play in the wetlands there. She and I have already done some of that. So that's the station. At the ranch, it's really driven by one person, Betsy Boughton, who is a former graduate student of Pedro Quintana Asensio. And so she's quite the botanical expert there at the ranch, and she's now the research director there, whereas the past research director, Patrick Bowen, there, yes, setting fire to grassland, is now in our department as well, okay? So we have a strong connection there with Archbold. We do a lot of our work there. A lot of our students go there. So the stuff that's been going on at the ranch is a bit different, okay? It's about a cattle ranch. It's about wetlands. It's about fire and grazing effects on wetlands, okay? That's what we've been working on. And also assessing other ranches in the area that we've been involved with. So an example of the ranch we had is there's about 3,000 head of cattle. They raise calves there and then ship the calves off to market every year. So it's a big supplier of calves to the north. There's about 4,000 hectares or so. There's two main pasture types, what we call intensively managed. They used to call improved. The cattlemen would call it improved. It's better for cattle, right? We said, I don't know, so maybe we should call it intensively managed. And then semi-natural. We don't say natural because there's been some manipulation. The cattle are herded with cowboys, yeehaw, through fences, and they turn the moose into this pasture, and then they'll come in and they'll move them into this pasture, and so they rotate cattle around different times of the year. It's fun to be there when they do that. Anyway, so this is a map of the ranch, and so this is a LiDAR image. You can see all the dimpled wetlands. This is the highest spot in the ranch, maybe a meter higher than here, okay? And so that's what I mean, the meter really makes a difference. This used to be a prairie in here. They still call it an Indian prairie for the old days. So wildflowers, et cetera, all through here. Now there's many ditches. Maybe you can see fine gray lines, lots of ditches. So in the center of the ranch has been the most intensively managed, and on the left and the right and the bottom are more of the semi-natural, okay? But many wetlands, again, close to each other. We've done a few things. When we started off, we're evaluating the patterns there and the land use and isolation effects on the vegetation differences. And so it's going to be hard to read this, but just as a reminder, I can tell you we saw differences in species richness and exotics and the conservation value and the soil total phosphorus between the two different kinds of pasture. So the pasture management for a long time has had a big effect. Ranchers laid phosphate fertilizer in the soil every year, and it's still there. It will be there a long time. They still put nitrogen into those soils. They disked. They seeded with sod grass. So those intensively managed pastures through the middle here are very different. They're like a lawn for the cattle, okay? Whereas on the sides, the semi-natural ones, they didn't do those things. Some ditches, but not too much. So two strongly different landscapes inside there. When we set out to do an experiment, we thought about essentially what John Chase talked about. He did this experiment in little cattle tanks, and he said essentially that that the regional factors like dispersal, what you could call stochastic processes, are more important in a natural system, but they become more important when local conditions are limiting. So if you have more fertilizer or some other stressors, the local factors become more important. That was an idea he got all kinds of attention for. This is from his study where he saw more variety, more heterogeneity in the permanent ponds. And if he exposed his tanks to just drought, he had a piece of pipe come out and he just simply tipped it down. And so the water drained down. And let's see, if I have aquatic plants and they lose water, some plants don't make it. Rocket science, yeah. And so he had a much more similar composition inside the drought treatments, yeah? So this is a straightforward idea where you shift from regional to local factors, yeah? Okay, so we have the ranch, and we set up these wetlands, 40 wetlands all around, where we have some that are highly managed, they're fertilized, they're disked, they're seeded and ditched, and they tend to be dominated by one plant, a juncus. And the cattle don't like to eat that because it gets spikes in their face, so they eat around it. And it turns out some of Betsy's work, it acts as a facilitator, actually, of some of the other species inside the juncus that the cows won't get to. But then if you take the cows away, those will seed outside. So it's an interesting dynamic there. But then if you have the semi-natural wetlands, they tend to be much more natural grasses and of other varieties. So really different compositions. And so we saw basically the same pattern that he saw, that John Chase saw. We had much more variety in the natural ones than in the in the intense ones. And this is for, let me see, plants. That's total community, everything. Plants, invertebrates, and ectothermic residents, vertebrates, fish and amphibians. So we saw very similar patterns, but less strong, less obvious for the invertebrates because I think they're much more free to disperse. If you think about one large aquatic beetle oviposits a sibling in this pond and then another sibling in another pond. Okay, they're much more mixed up, I think, the insects. But we saw the same pattern as Chase for the vegetation, for the vegetation and overall total everything driven largely by the vegetation. Okay, so those are the two different kinds of wetlands. So then what we started thinking about was that tipping from regional processes towards local processes, where we had the regional factors that were more important and they became less important with strong ranch management, intensive ranch treatments of fertilizer and ditching and disking and sod and things like that. Does that make sense? So then what we thought was, well, let's think about how would you restore these wetlands? What would you do about this? To restore the local conditions, that's really important if you have a degraded wetland, because that's what matters the most. But if you're trying to preserve the regional heterogeneity, you want to work on that when you have more natural wetlands, because we know what processes are driving wetland diversity now, right? So I don't know if that lesson translates to Doñana. Are you trying to restore some of the wetlands? Is there any need to restore some of those wetlands? Then I think maybe this lesson would cascade to other systems, but we could find out. Okay, so having that basis, just pastures, we set up a big experiment, which is what I think would be very difficult to do in a national park, where we had the two pasture types again, but we also had fencing or not and fire or not, because ranchers will burn a pasture to take down the woody vegetation, have a fresh grass growth for their cattle to eat. So it's a cattle management tool. So we had fences and we had, or not. There's Betsy and Pedro. This is one of my former students, Kim Medley. Just to show you, you can have pastures, you're walking around among the cattle, and then these very large gates and barbed wire fence to keep the cows out, all right? You might also tell there's a lot of growth inside that fence. 1 year after we fenced it, that's what those wetlands look like. They were took off because the cattle were no longer in them, okay? Big effect. We also, this is, that's Betsy. She's trying to sample. It was dog fennel. It's a fennel plant. It's a woody stem. She was actually allergic to it, and the pollen. It was terrible. So anyway, sampling, and this is obviously an unfenced wetland that first year, okay? And that's what I was talking about with the cattle's just watching you, right? All right, so then we had fires as well. So we had two kinds of fertilizer, if you will, or not, fenced or not, fire or not, all possible combinations, 40 total wetlands. The whole wetland was our beaker. Wetland was our experimental unit, okay? We fenced in whole things. We would put a chopped up disked fire break around and light the fire and go. This is John Fouth. He's very proud of himself lighting a fire, and watch this fire go, okay? It was pretty dramatic, some of them. And then there are the wetlands that were not fenced or not burned, and you can see the cattle egrets in there. They're on the backs of cows, okay? Those wetlands dip down low enough that the cattle will stand in there to be cool, especially at dusk. They'll come out in the evening out of the trees, and they'll go down in there, and they'll eat and stand there and just shred the vegetation and stay cool, and it's also a way to avoid getting eaten by mosquitoes. There have been cattle that have died from mosquitoes on ranches. They inhale so many of them during the night. Yes, there are a few mosquitoes in Florida. And so we have lots of these kinds of treatments, burned or not, fenced or not. This is one, a wide-angle shot. You can see the fire break and the whole thing smoldering, and then what it looked like afterwards. And the cattle go right in. They're poking around in there and see what they can find. Okay, so here's the interactive effects of all those treatment combinations. This is the pasture effect still coming through in a big way. Remember, fertilizer, disc seed, all that stuff. That's still the strongest signal that came through. We see that rising through even though the other treatments have been happening. We did eventually start to see some of those interaction effects. There's a lot on here. I just wanted to help myself notice that the single effects, pasture, fence, or fire, we were getting some significant effects. But by 2009 now, 2 years after fencing and a year after fire, we started seeing some interactions and even three-way interactions on some of the measurements. This was for beetles. The beetles are actually seeing an effect of these treatments. The aquatic beetles that fly in, even though they're dispersing all over the place, we saw a strong phylogenetic signature on the beetle communities due to these treatments. Three-way interactions. So within a couple of years, that was happening. I thought that was surprising. I thought that was fun. We had the interaction effects, the interaction plots. So burned, we see a decrease in diversity if it's managed, but we see an increase in diversity in the semi-natural ones that are not burned. So opposite effects, yeah? So complex. And we start talking about three-way interactions, it's difficult, yeah? So it's a complicated study to try to untangle when we have those three-way interactions. But that's still going. This experiment's still happening. We set this up in 2006, and every year Betsy goes out and counts all the plants. Boy, I'd like to get out there and count zooplankton and fish and everything else. We've done some other work now also on the soils in those same wetlands, where, again, I'm going back. This is between 2007 and 2009. So 2006, we took samples before fence. 2007, put up fences and collected soils. 2009, 2 years later now, we're collecting soils again to see what happens. We see an effect on bulk density and organic matter and a two-way interaction then on total phosphorus, but not a whole lot of different effects on soils. That makes sense to me. Those should be slower systems to change, I think. But we're getting the change between 2007 and 2009. We're seeing that the highly managed pastures are actually increasing total phosphorus when they're grazed, but we're seeing that it decreases in the semi-natural pastures when it's grazed. Opposite effects. So again, really interesting dynamics to happen in here. Now, 2007 to 2016, jump ahead in the soils. We're getting more of these, three-way significant interactions down here, two ways, pasture and burning, and then single effects. So we're starting to see more of those complicated effects pop up. But it takes a while for the soils, just like it's going to take a while for some of the other organisms, I think. So this is what we've been able to do at this private ranch, where they just say, yeah, go ahead and fence. Go ahead, yeah, we can keep the cattle out. I think it would be a lot harder at Doñana, yeah? Okay. So more effects. Okay. So overall, there's this legacy effect of land management. The phosphate especially is just going to be there for a long time in the intensively managed pastures. We have reduced diversity at the local and regional scale because of that legacy effect of fertilizer. There's this delayed three-way interactions that are starting to kick in, but it might take a while for some of these groups. We're seeing some interactions that counter those phosphate effects. We're starting to see maybe some approaches that reduce that legacy effect of long-term fertilizer application. And of course, the taxa some are more sensitive than others. That makes sense, and we can see that in the results. And I think this has lessons for land management that might be maybe helpful for the peripheries of Doñana, maybe inside Doñana. You guys can tell me. Okay, so what? You warmed up. It got a little better. Yeah? Anything else? Anything better than that? Okay, so this is a picture from here. Yeah? Beautiful picture. This is my best picture I have. I think there's some parallels. I think there's some matches that we could think of and mismatches. I think one of the big mismatches I want to add is the ways that we've been doing ecology. We skipped past natural history and jumped straight into this big experiment. Not necessarily wise, but that's what we did because we could, because we were allowed to, right? I think we could, I'd like to see if we can find a way to fix that. Otherwise, those things I already had on there. So I think those different research histories might be an interesting opportunity, actually. We have this private research station that tends to be experimental. Even the Archbold biological station, they have zones where they have a burn regime every 5 years or every 10 years or every 3 years. It's experimental fire regimes, which has big effects on the wetlands too. It's been much more applied at the ranch because it's, of course, a ranching context, where you guys, I think it's fair to say, have been more natural history oriented. I'm lumping categories here, but I think that fits in a national park. It makes perfect sense. Is that fair to say? Yeah? Where I think it's also fair to say you guys have been doing more of the basic and we've been doing less of the basic. Okay? Does that make sense? So I think this might be fun. What if we started sharing? What if we started thinking about how to take lessons from one site to another? I'm not saying you're going to put up barbed wire fences and burn, but maybe there's something that can translate. I don't know. I think we could compare diversity patterns. I'd love to get back to zooplankton. I'd love to. That'd be fun. And the environmental drivers of those patterns, just beta diversity kinds of questions, things like that, which I would love to do. We could start doing a lot more natural history in Florida, and I don't know if you guys could pull off experiments in Doñana. I don't know. For instance, I have two ideas. I've written all this stuff, and I used to play with dispersal ideas. I had to move on to other things because, oh, something shiny. Oh, I get distracted easily. And so I started chasing other things. But I've written about, I didn't see dispersal. I didn't see it much happening. There wasn't much evidence for it. These guys, you guys have been doing this really well. If waterfowl are the primary vectors of passively dispersed freshwater invertebrates, other than mussels, then even more emphasis should be placed on waterfowl conservation, etc. You guys have been doing that stuff. That's really cool. I think it's awesome, and I congratulate you for it. I think it's really nice stuff. But why didn't I see it? Why didn't I see more dispersal then? I grant you, it happens. Of course it does. It should. It makes sense. So, well, if I consider the flyways, I have to zoom in a bit. I can't play with them out here at these large scales. So if I zoom in a bit, this is where I used to work in my graduate work when I was watching things show up colonizing. There's not much water there. Not much to attract waterfowl, actually. That's in the middle of Virginia. Here's Richmond, Virginia, where one of my daughters lives. It's just out in the middle of tobacco country, okay? What self-respecting duck wants to land in a tobacco field, you know? So this is where I played around when I moved on later, and we put up windsocks and rain collectors and things like that. There is the Illinois River that comes down through here, but everything else around me is corn and soybeans. I had to know two kinds of plants in Illinois. Corn, soybeans. So there wasn't much water there either. if I think about Florida and where I've been talking about we could work at the ranch and places like that, this is, for example, the mallard, eBird data, and this gray zone here means that there's not much evidence of it. This is a cumulative history. No, I'm sorry. This is December 2017 to 2018. This is the cumulative all years in eBird. It's kind of an empty zone there in the middle. All data ever for eBird, okay? So mallards don't seem to come to the central Florida. They like the coast better, it appears. This is green-winged teal, also sort of empty. Now I grant you, not all the cattle ranchers are birders, right? So they're not necessarily recording the data. So this isn't perfect. Canvasbacks, one of my favorites, pintails, buffleheads. Finally I get one, blue-winged teal, okay? And a coot, they're all over the place in Florida. And finally, the black-billed whistling duck, primarily a southern species. So I'm going to just try. Why not? Given that waterfowl are important dispersal vectors, done. Then seasonality, isolation, and habitat size should affect their movement of seeds and propagules, etc., in among temporary wetlands. Yeah? Where I'm thinking the seasonality relative to migratory timing is wrong in Florida for the temporary wetlands. Why? Because they're already dried out in the winter when those birds have come down. So they're not attractive to those birds, right? And they're inland, whereas opposed to the coastal marshes they might choose to go to. Isolation, further from the coast, and habitat size, there are a bunch of small little wetlands in among a bunch of cattle ranches. So I think it might affect habitat use. Maybe that's why I didn't see it before. And thus the connectedness, and that means beta diversity of the propagules and all kinds of fun things. How about this? There's maybe a gradient like this, where I'm lumping Canaveral up here. That's where the rockets lift off from. The coastal marshes there, there's big marshes that they manage for waterfowl. I'm guessing that, no, that's not here. Those are roseate spoonbills at Canaveral, okay? They look maybe kind of like flamingos at first glance. So I'm wondering if there's a gradient like this of measured water bird activity and community or genetic similarity. I wonder if we could actually count birds where I'm thinking where I've been playing is at the low end and where you guys have been playing is at the high end. And maybe we count at the high end too at Canaveral. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but we could find out. Another one. I got a million of them. I started off playing with zooplankton. I love them. I have a hard time getting back to it now because I can't find students who want to work on them. Are we talking about temporary ponds or temporary fields? How long are the temporary ponds wet in Doñana? How long are they full of water? 5 months? 6 months? Yeah? Half a year? Depends on the year, yeah. Yeah. In some years, the hydro period is shorter than the dry period, yes? Okay. So are these temporary ponds or are they temporary fields that occasionally flood? There is a terrestrial phase to these systems, yeah? As an aquatic ecologist, it didn't occur to me early on that we should think of these as terrestrial, yeah? But I had a student, and we started taking eggs out of the sediments of these different ponds, and they get eaten. This is an Ephipium, this pouch right there for Daphnia has 2 eggs in it for Daphnia. And this, I don't know if you can tell, there's a round drill right there. It's like somebody augured into it. And then this one's been chewed on from the side. There are soil organisms eating these things, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's these guys, mites, and maybe other organisms. There's, I think, an extinction of an egg bank, maybe seeds too, for aquatic plants in these temporary wetlands. And I've got just preliminary data. This is a spectrum of hydro period from about 80, 90 days all the way up to a full year. And there's a bad curve fit here, but anyway, there's a pretty strong thresholding effect. Just a few ponds, not enough data to do anything with. And then this is eggs per gram of soil. And then eggs per Ephipium seems like it decreases pretty strongly, where you get over 1 if you get out to a whole year. So not all eggs are viable. But you get maybe 40% of the eggs are viable in the temporary ponds. So there is a big predation effect, I think, happening in these sometimes terrestrial systems. This has implications, as it might for other organisms. Source-sink metapopulation dynamics. Are some of these populations in the temporary ponds fading out fast, almost every year? Or is there a big predation effect that knocks them down, that changes perhaps the metapopulation genetics? Are we essentially thinking the same way we should think of with salmon, where salmon come up a river and they fertilize that riparian zone? Is the aquatic phase in a temporary wetland fertilizing the terrestrial phase? It's lipid, protein-rich packages in those eggs, and maybe boosting some of those terrestrial populations. What about maybe really strong habitat sorting in metacommunity dynamics, because you have this strong predation effect? It should have some limits on Luc de Meester's monopolization hypothesis, which says somebody gets there first, they grow like crazy, and they take over. Well, I'm seeing a lot of die-off, it looks like, and maybe they're not taking off so fast, right? It's always fun to argue with Luc. And then the predator infection avoidance might be some interesting sort of selection pressure. There's a lot of fungi eating these things too. When we open them up, we find a lot of those eggs that are infected with fungi. So I think there's some differences, maybe more natural history here, in these ponds that'd be fun to compare and contrast between Florida and here. Maybe something like this, maybe other ideas you have, right? So what if we started trying to figure out how to do that? What if we, I don't know, wrote a compare and contrast paper? What if we had people visit back and forth? Students, come over to Florida, okay? Bring your families. They'll love it there. I can point you to where it is on the map. It's on the other side of the city from me. It's easy to get to. Come on over. It's okay. What if we thought about, I don't know, funding? There's an NSF program which seems like it's not active right now with our current administration, but maybe it'll be resurrected again. There's maybe some ways we could do some matched analyses or sampling, something, right? I keep thinking, you guys already have this nice European network of people studying these wetlands. It doesn't really exist in the States. I would like to sort of mimic what has already happened in Europe, in the States, and maybe even have more comparisons back and forth across the Atlantic. So I think it'd be fun. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.